Welcome to GSBA Rapid Response, giving you the opportunity to ask questions with live answers. Today's immediate feedback comes directly from OutRight Action International, discussing COVID-19's global impact on the LGBTIQ community. My name is Joey Chapman. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I am the Membership Development Manager for GSBA and will be today's Rapid Response moderator. Along with fellow GSBA staff members tuning in, joining me today is Tareya Miller. Tareya uses she, her pronouns and is the GSBA Membership and Programs Manager. GSBA does continue to follow Governor Inslee's Stay Home, Stay Healthy order, currently in phase 1. Our staff members, they are practicing physical distancing, working remotely while staying socially connected with our up-to-date GSBA COVID-19 emergency resource page, which includes Washington State's reopening and recovery plan. And we also will have GSBA Rapid Response. So how does the Rapid Response work for you? Our format allows you to engage with professionals with questions in the wake of COVID-19. Today, we are streaming both live on Zoom and Facebook. So throughout the hour, feel free to ask questions of our guests via the Q&A features. Tareya and I will both follow along and do our best to ensure that those questions do get answers. So today, we would like to go ahead and welcome our very special guests, Ami Bishop, Senior Research Advisor of OutRight Action International, and Katie Holquist, West Coast Director of OutRight Action International. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Wonderful.
Delighted to be here.
Great, great. We just want to go ahead and take a few moments. Let you go ahead and give us a little bit of background, tell us a bit about OutRight, and let us know your involvement within the organization.
Great. I'll start and then hand it to Katie. I'm Ami Bishop, and I've been involved with OutRight actually for about 12 years. I was on the board for 9 years and co-chair of the board for 3 years. My background is in global health. I worked for many, many years at PATH. Many of you may know PATH, a global NGO working in global health. And for the last year and a half or so, I've been working with OutRight very closely as their research advisor. Katie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Holquist. I use she, her pronouns, and I am OutRight's West Coast Director. I have more than 20 years of nonprofit management and leadership experience, mostly focusing on girls' empowerment, global development, women's rights, and now LGBTIQ rights. I've been living in Seattle for 20 years. I have a wife and 3 kids, and I'm a huge Seattle Storm and Reign fan, as well as a proud GSBA member. Joy, would now be a good time for me to share just a little bit more about OutRight before we jump into what we're doing related to COVID-19?
Please do. We appreciate that.
Great. So for those of you who don't know OutRight, we are a 30-year-old organization. We're actually celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And our mission has always been consistent, and it's to defend and advance LGBTIQ human rights and equality globally, especially in places where queer communities face extreme persecution, discrimination, and violence. And we have a global reach. We have staff and board in 8 countries around the world. We consider Seattle our West Coast home base, since Ami and I are both based here. We have 3 board members who are based here and hundreds of supporters and volunteers in Washington State. And our programs really consist of 3 main strategies. The first is around research, which you'll hear more about today. We document human rights abuses happening to LGBTIQ communities around the world, and we conduct large global mapping studies about issues that are relevant to our communities. Some of you know that last year we released a big report around so-called conversion therapy and the incidence and impact of conversion therapy around the world, which was also authored by Ami. And you'll hear more in this webinar about our research around how COVID is impacting LGBTIQ communities. The second thing we do is support and resource grassroots LGBTIQ movements and activists. And we do that by providing training, technical assistance, and sometimes funding. And you'll hear a little bit more about that today as well. And the third thing we do is advocacy, primarily at the United Nations, where we are the only US-based LGBTIQ organization that has full-time presence and access at UN headquarters in New York. And we also coordinate the activities of the LGBTI core group at the UN, which is a coalition of 32 member states that are committed to protecting and advancing LGBTIQ human rights. We have a partnership-based approach in everything we do at the United Nations, with grassroots allies around the world, with leading companies and foundations, and of course with groups like GSBA. We're a longtime member of GSBA and have worked in coalition with GSBA and also with many other GSBA members on a number of issues, and really trying to demonstrate local and global solidarity for our communities. So I think I'll just stop there and dive into the questions that you have for us, Joey.
Sure. No, definitely. Your help is definitely welcome, especially during the wake of COVID-19. But let's go ahead and jump right into our rapid response Q&A. OutRight recently completed a rapid research effort to document the impacts of COVID-19 on LGBTIQ people globally. Ami, why did you feel this was an important thing to undertake?
Thanks, Joey, for the question. We felt it was extremely important to undertake this because we know from looking back at past global emergencies, crises, other kinds of outbreaks that have occurred, that our communities almost always get left behind, whether intentionally or inadvertently falling through the cracks. And so we felt it was extremely important to capture in real time what is happening around the world to our communities. We know that many of our communities are living a bit on the margins, just because of their current social atmospheres, the hostility of the climate in some countries. And so we were very concerned that their realities were not getting documented. The fundamental reason for doing this work ultimately though is for advocacy. So we wanted to document the stories and the realities facing our communities so that we could take that evidence to UN agencies, to donors, to humanitarian relief organizations, whoever is involved in pandemic response, and ensure that our message is clear, that that pandemic responses need to be inclusive and need to take into account our specific circumstances.
Could you go into a little bit of your approach on this work and how you found people to actually interview?
So we took a kind of a two-pronged approach to this. As I mentioned, we know that there's a fair amount of literature about how previous emergencies have been unfolded, and so we did a bit of a literature review, looking back. What can we learn from past experiences? What wasn't done well? What can we take and do differently in the context of COVID-19? But the real heart and soul of the work was conducting 59 interviews with LGBTIQ people from a total of 38 countries around the world. And we were able to find these people through our OutRight's extensive both professional, organizational, and even personal networks. So we engaged about 15 staff and consultants, trained them up in the interview tool, and then everyone was deployed, as it were, to conduct somewhere between 3 and 5 interviews each. And in that way, we were able to cover most regions of the world. We also were really trying to ensure diversity in identity. So we had about a third of just under a third of respondents identified as transgender, a little more than a third identified as gay or lesbian, and the remaining interviewees identified as queer or non-binary, gender fluid, or didn't specify. And we had also 3 people who were intersex as part of our respondent pool.
So we know that the measures to contain COVID-19 have been pretty devastating economically,
Yes.
On people everywhere. So in what specific ways are LGBTIQ being affected economically?
Yeah, so you have to take into consideration that in a lot of the countries where we're working and where we reached out for this work, significant portion of LGBTIQ people are working in more informal sectors. This is because they live in environments where stigma and discrimination remain serious barriers to access to education, to employment, to health. So when we went through the interview data, we identified 7 themes. One of the themes was clearly running through all of the interviews, devastation of livelihoods and increasing food insecurity. It was really, I mean, we did these interviews at the end of March, so respondents in their countries were living through the epidemic or the pandemic at different stages. Everybody was in different stages and different phases. But what cut across all was really the speed with which people were falling very quickly into economic insecurity and food insecurity. So we were, I think, shocked at how quickly that was happening. About half of those we interviewed talked about already experiencing food shortages, for example. We also heard quite a lot about the choice that needed to be made. If you're working in the informal sector on daily wages, the choice that needs to be made about, do I go out and work and risk being exposed to the infection, or do I not have food and some of the basic necessities? And I think that's a dilemma, a very challenging choice to make across all low-income people across the world. It's that with regard to LGBTIQ people, they are among those, and in some ways hit harder, because the other piece of this is that they have less access to food support and public programming that's providing relief. So for example, we learned through interviews that in the Philippines, in some parts of Manila, in some of the districts of Manila, that a lesbian couple was not recognized as being eligible for food support being doled out by the local government, because they didn't have a husband and they didn't have children within their family constellation. And so they were actually denied food support. We learned that in Sri Lanka, food support was being provided in some places through police stations. Sri Lanka is one of the countries in the world that criminalizes being gay. That is not a safe place for LGBTIQ people to go and get food relief. So this is some of the disproportionate ways that this pandemic is hitting people.
Just want to remind everyone that's tuning in today on Zoom or Facebook Live, definitely feel free to use the Q&A platform there to reach out to our panelists with any questions that you may have. We're definitely keeping an eye on that. I want to go ahead and toss it over to Terea, see if there is a question on her end.
Yes, Ami, what are some of the main challenges facing people in terms of health and safety today?
So health and safety are huge, huge issues in the context of many countries around the world. As I mentioned, just referring in response to the last question, that many contexts still are criminalized. So 68 countries in the world criminalize consensual same-sex relations. And that right away then puts LGBTIQ people's position in society in a very precarious place. In terms of health specifically, it's well documented that in those countries and in other hostile climates, and even in this country, it still occurs, where LGBTIQ people experience high levels of stigma and discrimination within the healthcare setting. Maybe they're concerned about being outed, being misgendered, having breaches of confidentiality. And so it's understandable that people are reluctant to seek care. This is magnified in those situations where prevailing societal stigma and discrimination is very high. And so what we learned through the research is that indeed, even respondents who knew people who were exhibiting what might have been signs and symptoms of COVID were delaying seeking health care. because they were really worried about what their treatment would be in the context of services. We learned that people were having disruptions. People living with HIV were experiencing disruptions in access to their HIV medications. We learned that transgender people and some intersex people were cut off from their supplies to hormone therapies and other kinds of gender affirming care because it was no longer considered essential. So if you will, I actually pulled a quote from our research I thought maybe I could share with you that sort of demonstrates this. And this is from a trans woman in Russia, and she says, "I will call the ambulance only if I'm suffocating, only if I feel a very real threat to my life. I'm afraid that if I get hospitalized, they will notify my family, and that would be the worst. I'm also afraid that I will be placed in the men's ward and that the doctors will not understand my situation, that they will treat me worse than others. And how under such circumstances could I continue my course of hormone treatment, which cannot be interrupted?" So those are the kinds of real threats that people are facing when having to consider whether to seek care and take care of themselves. The issue of safety, just to quickly touch on that, I don't want to forget that point because it's very important. Many of our interviewees did report either feeling at increased risk themselves or knowing others that felt at increased risk, particularly of domestic violence. And we're hearing that in this country too, that especially younger people who are, if their schools have been shut down, or people who've lost their jobs and having to return to their home environment, to their family of origin, where it actually may not be a supportive atmosphere, where it may be in fact a violent context, and that they're forced to cohabitate with people who are not supportive. And so we definitely heard about this. We also heard quite a bit on a more societal level about the ways in which religious leaders, political leaders are scapegoating the LGBTI community. This pandemic is your fault because of the sins that you're committing, kind of discourse and rhetoric. And this has very, very real implications for the safety and security of our communities where this is happening.
Wow, that's a lot of information. And I absolutely agree that story you told is just heartbreaking. And you mentioned safety and the increased risk that are happening. How are LGBTQ people coping with lockdowns and curfews in other countries?
Yeah, it's very hard to generalize because it varies, just as it varies within our own country, around the world. The degree to which people have access, for example, to internet, and whether they're paywalls to access the internet really has a big impact on whether people can stay connected virtually the way that we are. I think that what is so difficult about a disease outbreak is the need to self-quarantine, to isolate, to adhere to curfews. And so in a lot of contexts where we have had to identify, to find sort of chosen communities, chosen families, and seek the comfort of being ourselves among people outside of one's immediate family, this has been really very traumatic, actually, for a lot of people who feel especially isolated and cut off from those physical safe spaces. I remember that a Kenyan, queer Kenyan woman responded about, essentially she said that she was experiencing the stress of being removed from people who give you hope. And I think that kind of sums up how people are experiencing this isolation around the world in unfortunately many cases.
Different people, they're seeking connections with friends and other organizations to look for help and moving forward. What do you see for LGBT LGBTIQ movements, how are they being affected by the pandemic, especially in countries, where it's illegal to be gay?
Yeah, no, it's a huge question. We heard, because we did reach out to a number of activists who are involved or lead organizations, because we wanted to understand what was happening. What are the implications of this pandemic for your national, local movements and your organization? And there was a lot of worry about organizational survival, about setbacks occurring. So are donors who support us going to turn away from funding our issues? The other thing is that advocacy, local advocacy, is obviously critical, as it is everywhere, to affecting change over time. And if you can't actually do the work of advocacy, which involves gathering research, providing evidence, meeting with political leaders, convening, publishing, if all of that is, strategic litigation, for example, if all of that is suspended or cut off, then you're stalled. And this also has to be viewed in the context of where currently countries are actually taking, in some ways, advantage of this pandemic to push through very hostile laws through states of emergency or new legislation, and our communities are sort of blocked from responding. So an example is today, actually, unfortunately, Hungary just passed a law that effectively prohibits gender recognition, which means that transgender will no longer have the possibility of seeking gender affirming or gender recognition legally, to switch their gender marker. There was very little way to fight back, because this is happening in the context of Hungarian state of emergency that granted the prime minister and his party a huge amount of power. So that's just an example of the ways in which the movements are a bit stuck, and it's very concerning. I mean, we heard people literally say, we think our movement's being set back by 3 years, by 5 years. That combined with the economic devastation that's occurring globally, what we don't know if we're going to survive, if our organization can survive this.
Speaking of survival, I was wondering, Katie, could you share a little bit about what OutRight is doing to respond to the pandemic?
Happy to. The research obviously is a huge part of our response, and we really, because we've been doing this for 30 years and have relationships on the ground, from governments all the way down to activists all over the world that we've been developing for 30 years, we knew that we needed to adapt our programs to respond to COVID. And so we've launched 3 additional projects in addition to the research that we're working on in the immediate term. The first is that we launched an emergency fund. This is focused entirely on the global LGBTIQ community that is suffering from the effects of COVID and do not really have other resources to respond. We know that queer people are sometimes shut out or scapegoated and do not always have access to or trust the institutions that are resourcing relief efforts. So we knew that we needed to quickly mobilize support. And our emergency fund is providing grants to LGBTIQ organizations that are serving people impacted by COVID-19, and also supports our work to document and respond to the pandemic. So what we're doing is we're offering one-time general operating grants of between $2,500 and $10,000 to LGBTIQ organizations who are working with LGBTIQ people, both registered and non-registered organizations in regions that are outside of the US and Canada, Western Europe, Switzerland, Australia, and New Zealand. And we've raised a little over $600,000 so far from dozens of companies, foundations, and over 200 individuals, including companies like Calvin Klein, Microsoft, Gilead Sciences, foundations like Open Society Foundations, the Dunn Family Charitable Foundation, and the Channel Foundation. And during our 3-week application period from, I think it was April 8th to April 30th, we received over 1,500 applications representing more than $12 million in need. from around the world, 113 different countries. We had 728 applications from Africa, 376 from Latin America, 258 from Asia, 42 from Eastern Europe and Central Asia, 34 from the Caribbean, 34 from the Middle East and North Africa, and 12 from Pacific Islands. So really from groups all over the world. And the groups have been serving all segments of the LGBTIQ community, including youth, elders, all genders, abilities, etc. But all of the requests speak really clearly, as our research did, to an urgent humanitarian crisis that's unfolding among the most vulnerable in our community. Most of the requests that came in asked for support for food, shelter, housing, personal hygiene items, and medicines, including HIV medicine and hormone treatment. We also heard a lot of requests for transportation and internet access. So we have a really comprehensive vetting process that includes an eligibility screening, reference checks, review by several members of our staff and volunteers. We've learned a lot from GSBA about, through your scholarship review process, about how to involve volunteers. But we really vet the applications very thoroughly, and they get approved by our senior management team. And a couple of weeks ago, we issued the first 27 grants to groups in 23 different countries, including Fiji, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Pakistan, Kenya, South Africa, Cameroon, Liberia, Tunisia, Russia, Peru, Colombia, and several others. I will just share a couple of examples of the kinds of grants that we made. One is to an organization in Fiji called Youth Champs for Mental Health, who told us that the LGBTIQ community was essentially excluded from emergency assistance. So our grant is being used to provide food, housing, utilities, and cover medical expenses for their members. Another example is a group in Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyz Indigo, which told us that 85% of LGBT plus people in Kyrgyzstan have experienced violence or discrimination from government agencies, and they don't receive humanitarian assistance from the state due to the high degree of homophobia and transphobia. So our grant opened helplines to deliver basic packages of needs and items like hormones for trans people, and providing shelter for members who are in crisis. Our second round of grants is going to be issued this week, and we're looking at making additional rounds of grants available and distributing those in June and beyond, depending on the funding that we have available. So that's the first project. The second project that we've been working on is a weekly webinar series about the impact of COVID globally, what our staff is doing, what our partners are doing, and it's been featuring voices from around the world. So I would just like to let everyone know, we'll share a link to the webinar series later, but this Thursday at 8 a.m. Pacific time, we'll be doing a deeper dive into the grantees from our emergency fund, including involving and including the voices of a couple of our grantees. And next week on May 26th, we'll be doing a webinar that offers a little bit of a deeper dive into the research. But every week we cover different topics, go into depth and have speakers from all over the world sharing what's happening in different parts of the world and how they're responding to COVID. And then the third project that we launched is called OutRight TV. And it's a new video and podcast series that's available on a number of different platforms. It features the voices of our global program staff and also advocates and LGBTIQ people that we work with all over the world. It's regular people, it's activists, it's our former board member, Karamo Brown, all talking about life in the time of the pandemic. And sometimes the stories are heartbreaking. A lot of times they're hilarious, or just sharing how people are coping and finding joy. And so that's another thing that we have done that we're excited to share with people.
Very busy, which is, I'm sure, very much welcomed around the world. Dealing with the support, what has been perhaps like the main challenges in reaching everybody? And this could go to either one of you.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at it, and Katie chime in. I think, as you heard from Katie, the demand for support has far exceeded the resources, in fact, that we have. I mean, we're really, really pleased that we've been able to raise $600,000, but as you can tell from the number of requests coming in, there's no way we can meet that need to the extent that we want to. And so that's challenging, and it's made us now think about some strategies where we might identify some donors who could partner with us to kind of pick up some of the unmet need and fund directly, rather than through us, just fund directly some of the groups that we've identified. So we're working on that strategy to see if that can help us broaden the pool of people that we're able to reach. I think that, you know, the other challenge is that a lot of people out there aren't necessarily connected to organizations or even live in countries where they have strong advocacy or community-based service organizations dealing with the needs, addressing the needs of our communities. And so some work that OutRight did a couple of years ago showed that about 30 countries have no registered organization in the country working on LGBTIQ issues, which means there are a lot of people that are simply unreachable. And so that also is frustrating to know that they're out there, but we don't know quite how to get to them. So those are some of the challenges. But I do want to point out, so we don't give the impression it's all doom and gloom, because the other thing that we've seen very, very clearly is that even though we're not able to meet all the need, we've also seen an incredible resourcefulness among communities that have rallied around to gather whatever resources they have to buy food for their communities, even outside, you know, beyond the LGBTI community, but the broader community. So we do see a lot of hope in the midst of this really kind of tragic situation the world is facing. I don't know if Katie wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, Katie, did you want to add any additional input to that?
I think you covered it, Ami.
Okay.
Perfect. Well, let's jump over to Terea. I know a few Q&As have been coming in, so I want to make sure that we're able to keep up with those. Terea?
Yes, one came in from Jeff and Jeff. Do we know of any countries in the world that are collecting COVID infection or death data by sexual orientation or gender status, including male to female and female to male?
Do you want me to take that one, Katie? So I can't say that we've done a comprehensive review of where these data may be collected. I suspect that it's possible in some of the European countries, maybe that's happening. Among the countries where we commonly work, I'm pretty certain that's not happening. It's not actually even happening here. My thoughts about this are that it is, while it is extremely important that we do get disaggregated data on what's happening to our communities based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and sex characteristics for intersex people. You know, I say that with caveats that in a lot of places we need to be sure that protections are built in, that kind of data is not misused or abused or used against people. So it's a very important issue, and it's that we are counted, because if we're not counted, we're invisible, and our needs actually then go completely unmet and unseen, and that's not acceptable. But at the same time, pursuing a course of visibility needs to be done carefully. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, staying visible is really extremely important, especially in times like this when we are so often behind the scenes in society because we're in stay-at-home places. Question came in from one of our viewers. Can LGBT couples or individuals receive aid through other avenues, such as lesbian couples getting help from a women's organization, or are they reluctant to seek help from those groups due to their LGBT status?
Katie, you want me to go, or you want to go? Yeah. So it's, I think it's really very context specific. Certainly there are probably places where support is available through other means, through women's organizations, through feminist donor channels, and I certainly hope that that's the case. But it is also true. So it's a both and kind of answer. I think it's also true that there is some reluctance to seek out support from sources where that you may be concerned are not going to be supportive of you, unfortunately. But I don't want to suggest that there are no other avenues of support. I think that there can be, and they may be generated within one's own community, or they may be available through state services. But you know, referring back to some of the examples I provided earlier, the channels through which support is provided are not always accessible or acceptable to our communities. They just pose too much risk.
I just wanted to add to that, and you can maybe provide more context here, Ami, but one thing that we have talked about is that, you know, even some funders of relief efforts, or just in general of work that's being done in the area of gender equality, for instance, which you would think would be perhaps more likely to be inclusive, and perhaps is more likely to be inclusive than kind of a more mainstream donor. But even a lot of those funders or response mechanisms do not necessarily always include LGBTIQ people as part of the equation in terms of their gender equality strategy overall, or their relief and response efforts.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because we do hear a lot about sort of the gendered impacts of COVID or other kinds of, whether it's diseases or other kinds of emergencies, but the frameworks that are used to respond to these gendered impacts are often based on a pretty narrow framing of gender as cisgender women and girls. And there's very little attention to looking at some of the what we call intersectional factors, and to broaden the lens of gender to be more inclusive of diverse genders, gender identities and sexual orientations. And so I can definitely get on my soapbox on this topic, so that's one avenue of advocacy, is actually to press donors and humanitarian groups to consider the issue of gender a bit more broadly than they do currently.
Trey, did we have another question on your end? Oh, looks like we need to unmute you.
Thank you so much. Technology, I tell you. Does OutRight connect, Katie, this question's for you. Does OutRight connect folks in foreign countries to resources? Which specific countries did you visit?
Oh, we got you. There you go.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Can you say that again, or?
Yes, you bet. Okay. Does OutRight connect folks in foreign countries to other resources, specifically countries that you may have visited?
What? I'm going to toss that question over to Ami to see. I'm still not 100% sure if I understand what is being asked. But Ami, maybe it makes more sense to you?
Well, I mean, I'll take a shot at it, and the questioner can clarify if we don't hit it on, hit the mark. But I think what OutRight does do a lot of is try and foster exchange through convenings, through opportunities for cross-national interaction among activists. So for example, every December, although I think 2020 is going to be different, we bring together activists to New York City. They go through a training to learn about UN human rights mechanisms and engage in what we call a UN Advocacy Week. So that's an opportunity. It's not so much about us and who we visit, but it's about connecting activists across different countries to the mechanisms that they can use to advocate for justice, for equality in their national contexts. And so that we feel is one of the more effective ways to help sort of support from behind, if you will, the work of activists. It sort of falls into this category of what Katie was talking as one of OutRight's strategies of sort of resourcing the movement and advocacy, is really trying to invest resources into activists themselves to connect and to work across borders to strengthen our global movement. I'm not sure if I actually answered the question that was intended, but I tried.
That makes sense, Ami. Yeah, we would not necessarily be most likely to connect them to resources well, oftentimes we get requests from individuals in different countries. I know I get emails like this a lot. They're looking for support, and we can connect them to the organizations that we know in their country or region that can support them. And for instance, one thing that a research study that we did, gosh, it might have even been a couple of years now, that Ami also took the lead on, was a mapping project looking at, in all 193 countries, where are there organizations that are legally registered that are working on LGBTIQ issues. And so we, through that, and then through things like the emergency fund process, we have an extensive network. I mean, I think that we can't know everything and everyone who's organizing, but we have a very, very solid and extensive network around the world of organizations, so we can connect individuals to specific organizations. In a couple of cases, just to illustrate what Ami was talking about, we've helped create or fund or support coalitions that have emerged. Like, for instance, we have done a lot of providing startup funding and helping groups, particularly transgender and organizations serving gender diverse communities in the Caribbean, become established, and we've really helped seed and grow the movement there. And so that has included helping start and be a kind of co-convener of a couple of different coalitions in the Caribbean region, for example, that are looking at the rights and well-being of LGBTIQ people and transgender people in particular. The other thing that we do a lot of, which is related to the convenings that Ami mentioned, is connecting activists to, sometimes they don't have a relationship with their government in country, but when they come and work with OutRight at the United Nations, it may be possible for them to develop relationship, perhaps for the first time, with a government official, either from their country or from another country in the region, or from an allied country. And so making those linkages is often very helpful to then having them go back to their, to do their work on the ground, and have those connections kind of at higher levels of governmental power.
Got another question that came in. Are there countries using the pandemic crisis to try and slip under the radar and pass anti-LGBTQ legislation, such as criminalizing relationships, rolling back anti-discrimination policies, or even passing conversion therapy legislation?
Yeah, I'll take this one. Yes, I mean, in addition to the example that I provided earlier about Hungary, we're really concerned about some trends in various countries. Another country where I've actually done a lot of work in Liberia, right as the pandemic was sort of taking over the news. It was still in China, not necessarily spreading worldwide yet, but the chaos was beginning to unfold kind of globally about what's going to happen. In Liberia, a legislator there decided apparently that this was a good time to propose legislation that would actually strengthen their criminalization law. They already criminalize consensual same-sex relations through what's called an anti-sodomy law. And this legislator has put forward an amendment to that law that makes enforcement and punishment stricter, makes it an unbailable offense. The LGBTIQ coalition there has, with support of some UN agencies, successfully convinced this legislator to delay the introduction of this, but clearly the timing was such that the hope was that this might be an opportune moment to kind of slip this in when the world and the country is preoccupied. So unfortunately, I think we'll be seeing more of that. I think it's not so much necessarily in terms of formal legislation, but certainly abuse under the guise of disease control. So, for example, in the Philippines, again, where Duterte, obviously rules with a strong fist on a regular day, with the current state of emergency, we're seeing violations and excessive force being used to enforce curfews that seem to be targeting especially transgender people. We've also heard about this in countries like Indonesia. In Uganda, we're tracking very closely a situation where, again, under the sort of rubric of disease control, police raided a shelter for LGBTIQ youth and arrested 23 people, 19 of whom were ultimately imprisoned for 46 days without trial and without charge, but being alleged that they had violated the physical distancing rules that had been put forward. So this is, a clear example of using the pandemic and the means to control the pandemic to harass and humiliate and worse our communities, unfortunately.
Well, that's why we're thankful you're out there to help support the best as possible. Another question that came through was regarding the WHO. Does OutRight work with WHO?
The World Health Organization. Not in a direct manner. I mean, we try to collaborate, I think, and Katie, please chime in, and with a number of different parts of the United Nations and the UN. I mean, the WHO is certainly part of that. And so we will do advocacy with them when there are issues that are relevant, for example, for when we bring the activists to New York or to Geneva for convenings that will engage with them. The issue of, for example, conversion therapy, so-called conversion therapy, is getting more and more global attention, and partly, we and others have been involved in trying to really expose what's happening globally on that topic. WHO has yet to actually make a clear statement condemning conversion therapy. It's not that they support it, I mean, but they haven't made a clear statement, and we feel that that is really important to do. So that's something that we're looking at. So it's sort of issue by issue, and also depending on what our partner activists and advocates feel is crucial to bring up with them.
So yeah, it looks like there's another question that came into the Q&A box.
Can I just add something to that about the question about WHO?
Oh, sure, Katie.
It's not about WHO, but just on a related note. Because of the work that we do at the United Nations, a lot of it focuses, or some of it focuses on the Sustainable Development Goals. And OutRight has actually done a lot of work around trying to get UN agencies and, of course, governments to include LGBTI people, because with the theme being that no one is left behind, obviously we don't want our communities to be left behind. And in particular, we've done quite a bit of work around highlighting how LGBTI people can be included in the Sustainable Development Goal number 3, which is around health and well-being. And so if anybody is interested, I won't go into more detail about that right now, but I'm happy to share more information about that later with anyone who has a particular interest in health.
Perfect. We'll make sure all your detailed information is provided to folks as well, so they know where to reach out and connect. We did have one more Q&A from our question box there. Torreya, if you want to take that for us.
Great. There's great appreciation for your organization being shown out here. People are putting in thank yous and wonderful comments. There was a question that came through. Are there African countries currently invested or interested in abolishing conversation therapy?
Conversion therapy.
Oh, conversion therapy? Sorry.
Conversation therapy would probably be
Let's
a
have a
good
conversation
thing.
about the conversation therapy, shall we?
That's what we're doing right now.
Conversion therapy. So as I mentioned, I mean, this is actually been a really a kind of I don't want to say hot topic like it's a fashionable topic, but that has garnered a lot more attention. And OutRight right now actually is working with activist groups in Kenya and in Nigeria and in South Africa. First, to document what's happening with so-called conversion therapy, any kind of effort that is aimed at changing one's sexual orientation or gender identity or expression, forcefully against one's will, or not necessarily against one's will, because people actually also seek it out themselves when, you are so rejected by family, faith, and society that you feel it's your only way to survive is to change. And so we're working in these 3 countries to first document what's happening, but again, with the goal of then engaging in some very serious advocacy to hopefully put in place, whether they be policies, laws, other kinds of, for example, through medical or psychiatric, psychological professional societies to speak out against these practices. We just, probably you saw in the news that Germany became the 5th country in the world to ban conversion therapy at a national level. This is huge. The other countries are Taiwan, Ecuador, Brazil, and I always
Malta.
forget one. Malta, thank you.
Poor Malta.
Poor Malta.
They're the first ones that do it, but we always
Right.
forget them.
And very comprehensively. And so I think that we'll be seeing a lot more advocacy and work on this issue. We're also doing work on conversion therapy with our team and partners in the Caribbean. Similarly, because the Caribbean, there are many small countries comprised, it's much more of a regional effort. And I certainly hope that coming out of that work, we'll be seeing similar statements and efforts to really make this unacceptable on every possible level to continue. I don't know if I hope I answered.
It was great. It was great. Katie, I wanted to go ahead and toss to you. In addition to supporting the work of OutRight International and making donations to the COVID-19 Emergency Fund, what else can GSBA and others do to be more supportive of our communities in parts of the world that are struggling with the current pandemic? So in a nutshell, what can people do to learn more, and how can they help?
Sure. I will share some thoughts, and I would also definitely invite Ami to jump in if I miss something. So I want to share a few things related to what we're doing, but I want to say, vote. I know everyone just assumes that and maybe takes it for granted, but having leaders who believe in and fund institutions like the UN and WHO and believe in science, is helpful. So that is number one. Number two is to insist on being seen and heard. And I think it's up to all of us to always be asking questions of governments, funders, anyone who's coordinating relief and response efforts. What are you doing anything specifically that includes or reaches LGBTIQ people and communities? Without that question being asked and that pressure being put upon them, will not necessarily, it might not always be, sometimes it might be intentional for sure, but sometimes it isn't intentional, and it's just not one of their priorities or something that they see. So I think continuing to have our voices be made visible and audible and powerful is important. So to that end, we are really looking for opportunities to share this research. This is the first and largest study that we know of about how COVID is impacting LGBTIQ communities globally, but there are some other data points that are starting to emerge from colleague organizations. And I think that just reading and sharing our report and other information with people, with anyone, but with people who are involved in those relief and response efforts in any way is something that would be very helpful for us and for our communities. Sharing what OutRight is doing through the emergency fund, inviting people to join our weekly webinar series. And I know that my GSBA friends are going to share some links for all of this, but joining our weekly webinar series, watching or listening to OutRight TV, following us on social media. I mean, even though I work for OutRight, I learned so much by following OutRight on social media, because a lot of what we do is sharing, not just, most of what we do actually is not about sharing our work, but it's about sharing news about what's happening around the world, and especially from colleagues who are on the ground around the world. So I highly recommend that. And then finally, just you're reaching out to me and reaching out to Ami to talk more personally about ways that we can work with you, conduct briefings for your company or network, or in other way, brainstorm out ways that we can collaborate with you to make sure that this information gets out there and that our communities are not left behind.
We're getting close to the top of the hour. Ami, did you want to share any final words of wisdom as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, I echo much of all of what Katie said. I think all of those things are important. She and I are both here in Seattle. We're also connected with a whole group of people who are sort of OutRight ambassadors, we call them, supporters. And we're really happy to come and speak. We're really happy to, for years now, when we've had activists come through Seattle, we've tried to provide them with the opportunity to share a bit about their realities. Louise Chernin knows that from years and years and years ago, I always made GSBA one of the stops for activists coming through town, so that we all can just learn from each other about what we're doing, how we are pushing forward to ensure that our lives are valued, that our rights are respected, and so I think Katie and I are extremely open to sharing what we can, sharing information, and also helping provide access to people who are coming through who can speak much more eloquently about their own realities than we can in representing them. But I want to just thank you all so much for the opportunity to talk with you today. It's been great.
Well, we thank you for sure. We had the chance to go ahead and put up on the screen the slide that you provided with all the links and details for the folks to be able to grab that for future research. If you look in the Zoom chat box as well, we were able to go ahead and put the link for the full report there. So
Great.
Feel free to take that information along with you as you choose. So, on behalf of GSBA, we would like to thank everybody for joining us today. Special thank you to you, of course, Ami and Katie from OutRight Action International for sharing with us, the research during COVID-19. GSBA members, if you have any follow-up questions, or if we may have missed a question of yours today, please reach out to the GSBA membership team. We are here to help answer any questions that you may be looking for answers. You can also always go ahead and visit the GSBA online guide and directory to find full lists of members ready to help connect with you. The directory features hundreds of businesses that support equality for all.